Okay, so now we're going to cover some information that is a lot like endocrinology, a little introduction to anatomy and physiology, and basically how things are organized inside of an animal, and the regulation of those things. And a big theme in here is form fits function. And what I would know is the definition and the difference between these two terms, anatomy, which is the study of the form of an organism, and physiology, which is the study of the function of those forms. So form fits function, meaning that things are made in our body in such a way that it enhances the function that they are supposed to provide, right? Um, to kind of get you introduced into this idea of endocrinology and positive negative feedbacks and some of the other concepts that we're really going to delve into, it's important to revisit the fact that humans and other animals, not just mammals, but other animals, are multicellular. And so having many, many cells allows us to have those certain cells be specialized for certain things. So for instance, if it was really, really easy to clone things, if you could just take a cell and make it into a new body, um, and to some point that is used. But for instance, like you couldn't take a liver cell and have it turn into a kidney, or you couldn't take just a hair cell and make it become a whole living animal usually. So if you take one cell and try to clone it, it's going to make more of itself. And certain cells are very, very specialized to perform certain activities. I would also recall and remember the hierarchy of functionality in our body, the layers of organization. So remember, we have cells, and cells are organized. Cells are the smallest unit. Cells are organized into tissues. So tissues are made up of cells that have similar appearance and a common function. Many tissues are grouped together into functional units called organs. And then groups of organs that work together are called organ systems. So this table gives you an idea of these organ systems, and it tells you what the organ components are. And then you can deduce, of course, that like in your digestive system, the mouth, the pharynx, esophagus, stomach, intestines, liver, pancreas, anus, the mouth is made up of tissues, right, that make up the mouth. Those tissues are made up of cells that are very similar to one another, which are going to be a lot different from looking at the circulatory system, cells that make up the blood vessel or even the blood. So I would kind of familiarize yourself with different organ systems. You don't need to specifically know what the main components are of them, but just understand that there isn't a hierarchy of things. Cells make up tissues, which make up organs, which make up organ systems. What I would know is that we can group animal tissues into 4 different categories. And I would be able to recognize and understand how an organ is made up of these tissues, what types of organs might be made up of these tissues. So our 4 categories of tissues are epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And so epithelial tissue is going to be part of the digestive system, but it's going to be the skin, right? And other things. Skeletal tissue is a lot easier to understand, and that the heart has skeletal tissue or muscle tissue, I'm sorry. In this case, skeletal muscle tissue is the example. And it's showing, of course, the muscle of the animal. There's connective tissue, which is really blood, and loose connective tissue, which has to do with the digestive tract and connecting all that and holding it all together into some sort of a matrix. The nervous system would be made up of nerves, the nervous cord, the brain, all different things that are going to make the whole nervous system work as it should. So I'd read through the book and kind of familiarize yourself with that. So for an animal's tissues and organ systems to perform the way that they should, they have to act in concert with one another, right? They have to act together with one another. And one of the ways that we get that coordination is through the endocrine system and a nervous system. I would absolutely know the difference between endocrine system and nervous system, but also how they work together. So the endocrine system is this example on the right-hand side, this picture. Endocrine system have these molecules. A stimulus is received. The cell releases a molecule into the bloodstream, and it hits a blood vessel, it gets spread around the body. What you notice here is that it's not directly transported. This hormone is just kind of squirted out by this cell. And the surrounding tissues, surrounding cells are supposed to figure it out, right? And take it in and do something specific with it. So if you just kind of go through this image right here, a stimulus is going to hit the cell. This sparks the cell to release a hormone into just the matrix anywhere, which is going to attach to a blood vessel. And then the blood is going to take it to where it needs to go. There are these receptors on these cells that accept it and elicit some sort of a response. And because these cells, or these receptors on these cells, are meant specifically for these little hormones, the response that occurs is what should happen, and we shouldn't have a weird response. In the nervous system, you get a stimulus that hits the cell body. So this whole thing is your nerve cell. If you imagine your arm as being a nerve cell, your palm of your hand is the cell body, and that's where the neuron is. Your arm is called the axon, and that's the branching part that attaches to another axon. Your fingertips are kind of these little fingers that are things that receive the stimulus, take it to the cell body, down the axon, and it could be multiple nerves that receive this impulse until it hits what it's supposed to hit to elicit some sort of a response. So let's take a really simple example, like you touch something hot. Your hand touches the hot pad. The stimulus on your fingertips is something is really, really hot. It's going to travel from nerve to nerve to nerve to nerve until it reaches your brain, and the response that your brain gives your body is to move the hand away. Sometimes there are really, really big, long nerves where only one thing, where you don't have to have multiple nerves that send the message. The idea is that the more nerves that you have attached until it reaches until the message reaches the brain or wherever it reaches, the less the stimulus is. So it weakens as it spreads. So nervous system, the neurons transmit signals along dedicated routes connecting specific locations in the body, versus an endocrine system where it's released into the bloodstream until it reaches where it's supposed to be reached. I would know the difference between those two. Signaling molecules by the endocrine system are called hormones. Hormones have effects in a single location, or it can be all throughout the body. And the same hormone can have different effects on different things, elicit different effects. Only cells with receptors for a certain hormone can respond to it. So that allows the body to do specific reactions, as opposed to a hormone is released, it's released all throughout the body, and every single part of the body reacts. Only those cells that have those little purple V-shaped receptors are those that can respond to it, have the ability to do it. Endocrine system is well adapted for coordinating gradual changes that affect the entire body. So that's another big difference between nervous system and the endocrine system. Endocrine system, it's a slow, gradual change. Think of testosterone or estrogen on a prepubescent boy or girl. These changes are slow. They don't, although it may seem like it sometimes, it doesn't actually happen overnight, and it doesn't happen immediately. Whereas with the nervous system, you touch something hot and you are going to move away pretty close to immediate. In the nervous system, the signals are called nerve impulses, travel along communication lines consisting mainly of axons. Those axons are like your arm, and it's the route, it's the highway that takes the stimulus to the brain or to whatever cell is going to elicit a response. Other neurons, muscle cells, and endocrine and exocrine cells can all receive nerve impulses. Nervous system communication usually involves more than one type of signal, and the nervous system is well suited for directing immediate and rapid responses in the environment. Now, we mentioned this thing called an exocrine gland, right? I would know the difference between these two. Endocrine glands are usually ductless organs, right? Um, Endocrine glands just kind of secrete the hormones directly into a surrounding fluid, and then it gets into the bloodstream. An exocrine gland has a duct that carries the enzymes or these substances into body cavities or onto the body surface. So if we blow that image up, an endocrine gland, the hormones are secreted into the blood and it's contained inside something. Whereas an exocrine gland, and this is kind of spelled in the, I guess, like the United Kingdom version, the chemicals are produced by the gland and released directly onto either skin surface or onto an organ or something like that. And one example, a good example of explaining this would be maybe pheromones. Certain animals produce a pheromone directly onto them, or like a musky scent that you might smell on animals that would indicate that you're part of the same family, or you're part of the same species, or it's ready to mate or something like that. Here are some examples of glands that are within the endocrine system. And I'm not going to go through each and every one of these, but I would say that it would be a really good idea to kind of familiarize yourself with the gland and the important hormones that they are going to release. Stimuli that cause endocrine cells and glands to release hormones are very varied, and it can even be varied within the lifetime of that animal. So for instance, what happens when you have testosterone that's released when you're a prepubescent male is going to be much different than when you're an adult male, right? Hormones can be released in response to organic molecules, nervous system signals, or other hormones. And when we say organic molecules, well, I guess, examples might be taking certain vitamins or certain supplements in order to get your body to release more of a certain hormone. The hypothalamus is this little tiny almond-shaped region of the brain, and it controls most neuroendocrine signaling in mammals. And so it's just this little tiny thing kind of right there. So I'd know what he is and what he does. What I would also understand is that the signaling process, there's an initiation and there's a termination. It doesn't happen forever and ever and ever. So when a signal is sent, it will terminate. If it doesn't terminate, then something is going haywire with the body. And we're going to get a lot more in depth with this, but I want to introduce first this idea of negative feedback, which slows a stimulus down, and positive feedback, which reinforces the stimulus to keep going. It increases the response until something tells it to stop. So one example of negative feedback is how our body digests food. So when we consume food, the stomach has a lot of stomach acid in it, right? And it's going to break down the food. But that food with all that acid in it is not really in a way that it needs to be so that our body can absorb the nutrients properly. So there's some coordination and controlling that pH so that the body can use food properly. And basically so it doesn't just eat away at your gut as it leaves the stomach. So after the stomach is this little organ called a duodenum or duodenum. It's pronounced different ways, and I've always known it as a duodenum. But that duodenum detects the acidity from the food coming out of the stomach, and the duodenum starts to release this hormone called secretin. So there's endocrine cells within the duodenum that secrete secretin, and that secretin tells the pancreas to raise the pH in the duodenum somehow. So the stimulus is that there's low pH in the duodenum. The duodenum secretes a hormone called secretin. That tells the pancreatic cells to release something called bicarbonate, which is basically a buffer, or it's Actually, it's more of a really strong base, or it's a base that's going to make that pH rise. And so it's neither going to be too basic or too acidic, but it's going to be of the perfect pH so that our body can properly absorb nutrients like it should. And once the pH in the duodenum is now neutralized, then that causes the stimulus to stop, because it's now, we've neutralized and the stimulus has now ended, because the stimulus was the pH level. So let's just watch this real simple example of negative feedback.
This simple animation illustrates the principle of negative feedback, or feedback inhibition, in the regulation of a chemical reaction sequence in a cell. The sequence involves 4 molecules, A, B, C, and D. 3 different enzymes catalyze the conversion of one molecule to the next. The final product, D, inhibits the first enzyme in the sequence. When the concentration of D rises to a certain point, the reaction shuts itself down.
Okay, that video is not really that, I don't know, I think it's a little bit more confusing than maybe the way that I described it, but it might be easier to understand for some people. So for many hormones, secretin is triggered when the nervous system detects and processes a stimulus. In vertebrates, neuroendocrine signals involve the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland found at the base. This little pituitary gland is actually made up of 2 different things. So the posterior pituitary gland is an extension of the hypothalamus. It's going to just store and secrete hormones that the hypothalamus made. And the anterior pituitary gland actually makes its own and releases its own hormones. I might know the difference between the posterior and the anterior pituitary gland, and what kind of hormones it might synthesize or release. So what the example of food and pH and releasing that base that's going to make the pH more neutral is an example of negative feedback, because it shuts the stimulus down, right? The stimulus ended, it shuts down that process. An example of positive feedback is where it continues, a stimulus makes more of itself. It basically snowballs. And so the best example for this is when there's a nursing mammal. And so there's a stimulus that hits the mammal, and that is the baby that suckles. That suckling it's obviously nervous, right? It's detected by neurons. It generates a nerve impulse that reaches that hypothalamus. The hypothalamus starts to release oxytocin because it received that nerve impulse from the baby suckling, and oxytocin stimulates further release of the milk. So something had to get it started, and that was the suckling. As long as that baby suckles, the hypothalamus continues to release oxytocin, making more and more and more milk. When the baby fills up, there's no more nervous system impulse. The neurons are not feeling that impulse anymore. And so the hypothalamus stops shooting out oxytocin, and so no more milk is going to be released or made, right? And so here's what that looks like. So the suckling is the stimulus. It travels up to the hypothalamus, and it tells the hypothalamus to release oxytocin. Oxytocin kind of relaxes the muscle in the mammary gland so that milk is let down and released, and milk is, of course, then released. So that response, along with that stimulus, as long as that stimulus is going, it's going to keep happening. So the response causes more, because obviously milk has let down, the baby's going to suckle more. And so it's a positive feedback, because it continues to loop and loop and loop until the baby gets full. And then suckling stops, which now the hypothalamus is not receiving that impulse. It's going to stop producing oxytocin, and milk is no longer going to be released. This slide is about that anterior pituitary pathway. So makes lots of different types of sets of hormones and secretes those. And the function of these hormones ranges from reproduction to metabolism to stress response. And so I would just kind of familiarize yourself with, or basically going through different glands, endocrine glands, so that you can get an idea of what these things, the most important ones, and what they do. Um, and usually the anterior pituitary hormones will cause this hormone cascade. So it definitely snowballs and makes many, many different things happen. And so you get feedback regulation in multiple levels when you have these hormone cascades. And this is an example of, a hormone cascade. We're not really going to go in depth with this, but you can see that hormone levels drop, it secretes this, which then secretes this, which then makes this happen. And you just have this huge cascade causing more and more and more things to be released until the body levels itself out the way that it's supposed to. What I also might know is that hormones are soluble in water, but they're not soluble in lipids. And so when we talked about those cells having receptors and how only certain hormones can act on the cells that have the receptors, that's why. And so the responses between cells is called signal transduction, and I would familiarize yourself with that quite a bit if you can. I would also understand the concept that hormones elicit more than one response. So one great example is this fantastic hormone called epinephrine, and this is secreted by the adrenal gland. It's basically our fight or flight hormone, and it does a number of different things. It raises blood glucose levels so you can run. You have a lot of energy, you can get going, a burst of energy. It increases blood flow to the muscles so that they don't get tired, so that they have a lot of oxygen and there isn't fatigue. And it decreases blood flow to the digestive system. So if you're an animal and you're a deer and a mountain lion is chasing you, you don't want to stop to go to the bathroom. And by decreasing blood flow to the digestive system so it kind of stops working is actually very, very beneficial to whatever animal or mammal, other animal, human who's in a fight or flight position. So the hormone here is epinephrine, and it's going to, when it's released into the bloodstream, it's going to react on different cells different ways. Same hormone, but it's now on a liver cell, and on the liver cell, once it's bound, it tells glucose to be released into the bloodstream so that you have a burst of energy. On smooth muscle cell, it's going to relax them so that you have an increase of oxygen and your muscles can go instead of being all tight and drawn up. And then also on smooth muscle cells, specifically in the intestines, once it attaches, the cell contracts, which means that it's not going to do what it wants to do. Okay, so faced with environmental fluctuations, animals have got to somehow manage their internal environment by either regulating it or conforming to it. So an animal that is a regulator uses internal mechanisms to control internal change despite external fluctuation. So a great example of this is like a warm-blooded creature, right? The blood regulates, the temperature is regulated inside. It doesn't matter what the temperature is outside to some extent. An animal that's called a conformer allows its internal conditions to change in accordance with external changes. That would be like a cold-blooded animal, right? Now, some animals can regulate some internal conditions and not others. So, like one example is fish. They conform to the temperature in the water, but they're able to regulate the solute concentrations in its blood. So it regulates, how salty, like especially for saltwater fish, they have to get rid of some of the salt. So they're able to regulate that. However, they can't regulate their internal temperature. And the bottom line in all of this is that organisms have to maintain something called homeostasis. And this is like a steady state. So there's an internal balance regardless of what's happening outside. And they're either conforming or regulating in order to reach homeostasis, right? Homeostasis is a really, really important term that I would know. I would be able to define. I'd be able to kind of recognize an example of what homeostasis is. In humans specifically, we regulate we have to maintain homeostasis in temperature, blood pH, and glucose concentration. And an example, like the most quintessential example, simplest example of homeostasis is looking at the thermostat, and a thermostat being the heater. So room temperature is set at 20 degrees Celsius. I think that's like 75 degrees Fahrenheit. If the room temperature increases because a bunch of people come in and they're hot and they're sweaty, the room temperature increases, the thermostat is going to shut itself off. That causes the room temperature to decrease to the point that it likes until more people enter, or a lot of people entered the room, caused the temperature to increase, the thermostat shut off, room temperature started to decrease, and we hit our ideal temperature, our homeostasis again. But now all those people leave the room and the room temperature starts to decrease because we don't have the body temperature in there, right? That's going to tell the thermostat to turn itself on. And now room temperature is going to increase until we reach homeostasis again. So constantly changing. Homeostasis doesn't mean that nothing is happening. It just means that the body is constantly keeping things regulated. Animals achieve homeostasis by maintaining a variable at or near a particular value or set point. So like our set point for temperature in our body is what, 98.7 or something like that. And it fluctuates. You take your temperature all times of the day. It could be between 97 and 99. But once it gets beyond that ideal range, you're either you're too cold, something's going on not right, or more likely for people, you have a fever and you're way too warm. When you fluctuate above or below a set point, that is considered a stimulus. And that is detected by some sort of a sensor which will elicit a response. The response returns the variable back to the set point. Homeostasis in animals relies largely on negative feedback. So negative feedback is a lot more common than positive feedback. A control mechanism that reduces the stimulus. So negative feedback reduces the stimulus because it fixes it. Homeostasis moderates but doesn't eliminate changes in the internal environment. So looking at the thermostat, it's constantly turning on and off. Think about the way it is in your own home. It's not eliminating changes, it's just moderating them. So if we look at thermoregulation, which is maintaining homeostasis where internal temperature is involved, we have two different types of animals. We have endotherms and we have ectotherms. Endotherms generate heat by metabolism. These are us. Birds and mammals are endotherms. Ectotherms are animals that gain heat from external sources. So these are fish, amphibians, non-avian reptiles, although birds aren't considered avian. But ectotherms are like your lizard that accidentally gets out of the cage and it goes into the window to sun itself, but then a cold front comes in or it stays there overnight and it gets so cold that it stops moving. And then you have to move it to a heating pad and it starts to move again, right? They gain their heat from external sources. So a lot of these animals are found in more tropical environments as well. So endotherms can maintain a stable body temperature in the face of large fluctuations in environmental temperature. So you see a lot of mammals in places where it's extremely, extremely cold, and birds, so penguins, walrus, seal. Ectotherms may regulate temperature by behavioral means like sunning themselves, consuming less. They also consume less food because their heat is largely environmental, whereas endotherms, it's metabolic. So you have to eat a whole lot to maintain your metabolism, but also in the case of something being really in a really cold situation, it has to have some sort of fat. So organisms can exchange heat by 4 physical processes, and I would understand these. So it's either radiation, where basically it's coming in and bouncing off, right? Heat comes in, if it's too hot, it bounces off. Evaporation, which would be releasing water to evaporate off, like when we sweat. Convection, like using airflow, that kind of thing. Conduction. Heat is always transferred from an object of higher temperature to one of lower temperature. In response to changes in environmental temperature, animals can alter blood flow between their body core and surface. So the two terms for that would be vasodilation and vasoconstriction. Dilation, you widen, you open the blood vessels, and that promotes heat loss. Constriction means that it shrinks the blood vessels and you get reduced heat loss. So when you're really hot and sweaty, your face is usually really rosy and red, right? When you're super duper cold, you turn blue and your face turns really pale. Also, a lot of times the arrangement of blood vessels allows for this kind of counter current exchange. So like in Canadian geese and their legs, the legs are exposed. They don't have feathers to protect them, right? Warm blood will travel down an artery and cool off as it gets further, closer to the heel of the foot, and then transfer over to a vein where it will come back and warm itself back up again. Another thing is that things can become acclimated to certain temperatures, and you can see this in humans, right? We are fairly well acclimated to very, very hot temperatures, whereas people that live in places that are extremely cold, Alaska all the time, if they came here in the summertime, they have heat stroke and they have major, major problems breathing and adapting to it. Same with us. If we go somewhere where it's extremely cold, while in Alaska they can wear just a short sleeve shirt and jeans when it's 20, 30 degrees outside, we're completely bundled up because we become acclimated to the environment and the temperature that we're in. Acclimation in ectotherms includes adjustments at the cellular level. Some ectotherms that experience sub-zero temperatures can produce antifreeze compounds to prevent ice formation in their cells. Insects are an example of that. While insects aren't technically really ecto or endotherms, they're closer to an ectotherm than an endotherm. But they actually have a chemical in their blood that basically is like an antifreeze. So even though it freezes a day or two in Texas, we never actually have a complete kill of insects because they have this flowing through their body so that they don't technically freeze. Thermoregulation in mammals is controlled by the hypothalamus, which is a group of nerve cells functions as a thermostat. Remember that hypothalamus is in the brain. So hypothalamus triggers heat loss or heat generating mechanisms. This hypothalamus, although it's as teeny tiny as it is, does a lot of different things for our body. And without it working properly, we can't survive. Fever is a result of a change to the set point for a biological thermostat. We talked about that. Another thing that we have to have some balance in is this osmoregulation. So this is the process by which animals control solute concentrations. So we can't have too much salt in our body or too little salt in our body, right? If you're given an IV of pure water, it's not saline where it has a little bit of salt concentration in it. Basically, your cells are going to burst because it needs some salt inside of it, right? If you're given way too high of a concentration of salt, your blood cells are going to shrivel up, right? So osmoregulation is the process in which animals control solute concentrations. Several mechanisms have evolved for excretion, the process that rids the body of nitrogenous metabolites and metabolic waste products. There's a lot of nitrogen in what we excrete, right? And so our kidneys have figured out a way to make excretion happen properly and regulate things. This should be a review for you, but osmolarity is the solute concentration of a solution, and it's the movement of water across a selectively permeable membrane. So the salt can't come in, but but the water can or leave, right? So if you're given a saline solution in your blood cells, only water can enter the blood cells, the salt can't. But the blood cells, if it's too much, way too much salt, the blood cells have less salt than the super salty IV that you're getting, And so the water wants to leave to even things out, and your blood cells will shrivel up. You're given pure water instead of saline solution. The water wants to enter your cells because there's more salt inside the cells than that pure water that was put into your IV, and your cells will burst. If two solutions are isoosmotic, the movement of water is equal in both directions, right? Two solutions differ, the net flow of water is from lower solute concentration to a higher. And that's really just review from last year. So osmoconformers are a lot of like marine animals where their surroundings, they're isoosmotic with their surroundings, and they don't have to regulate their osmolarity. Their body is just as salty inside as it is outside. Osmoregulators expend energy to control water uptake and loss in a hyperosmotic or hypoosmotic environment. So, like for marine fish and freshwater organisms, obviously their challenges are going to be opposite of one another. Marine fish drink a lot of seawater to balance their water loss, and they excrete salt through their gills and kidneys, whereas freshwater fish drink almost no water and they replenish their salts through eating. Which is exactly why you cannot put fresh water into salt water or salt water into fresh water. And when you have certain fish that can do both, it's kind of a huge anomaly and very interesting situation. Land animals have mechanisms to prevent dehydration. So we have body coverings that reduce water loss, hair, feathers, that kind of thing. We drink a lot of water. We require a lot of water. We eat a lot of moist foods. And we also produce water metabolically sometimes. The type and quantity of animal waste products greatly affects our water balance. So among the greatest waste in our body is this nitrogenous breakdown of proteins and nucleic acids. And so we produce ammonia in some way. Urine smells like ammonia for most mammals, at least. So we will convert toxic ammonia to something less toxic before we excrete it out of our body. So let's just move on to this. Different animals will do different things. So aquatic animals, when they break down foods, proteins, amino acids in their food, what comes out of their body is ammonia, is pure ammonia. Animals produce urea. Urea is in our urine. That's where the name urine comes from. And birds, reptiles, insects have something called uric acid instead. So when the birds don't actually pee, it all comes out as one thing. That little white spot that you see on gecko poop and bird poop, that's the uric acid that they're excreting. In most animals, osmoregulation and metabolic waste display rely on transport epithelia. These are epithelial cells specialized for moving solutes in concentrated amounts in specific directions. And so in humans and a lot of other mammals and other animals, this would be our kidneys. So I would get a good general idea of our kidney and the parts of the kidney. So animal species produce a fluid waste by refining a filtrate derived from body fluids. So we have filtration, which we filter our body fluids, get rid of the waste, keep the good stuff. Reabsorption, reclaim the good stuff that we might have popped out. Secretion, which is adding non-essential solutes and waste from the body to the filtrate. And then excretion, releasing processed filtrate containing nitrogenous wastes. So our blood comes in, right? There's a filtration process that happens. Things get kind of separated out. We reabsorb the good stuff. We kick out the bad stuff. Good stuff that can just come directly in is secreted. And then everything that's bad is excreted, right? Okay. So osmoregulation in excretion is our kidneys in most vertebrates and some of the other chordates. Kidneys are a bunch of different tubules that have those networks of capillaries so that that excretion process can happen, filtration process can happen. So I want to show this video of the nephron. Nephron is, hopefully it'll show it to you, but the nephron is a component.
The outer part of the kidney is called the cortex. Inside the cortex is the medulla. Urine collects in the renal pelvis and drains from the kidney through a tube called the ureter. A tiny branch of the renal artery carries blood to each nephron for processing. A tiny vein carries blood away. Blood pressure forces fluid through the walls of a cluster of capillaries called the glomerulus, and it collects in the cup-shaped Bowman's capsule. The filtrate is refined as it passes through the twisted nephron tubule. Useful substances are returned to the blood, and the remainder collects as urine. Refined urine is carried by the collecting duct into the renal pelvis for excretion from the body.
That's actually a really good video to understand how the kidney works. And so I might take a moment to rewind yourself on that one so that you can watch it a couple more times. So I would familiarize yourself with the kidney, the general kidney structure, and I would definitely understand that when you take a chunk out of the kidney, right, you've got this thing called a nephron, which makes up the kidneys. And inside the nephrons are all of these capillaries in this, which has that Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus and loop of Henle and all those different things. I would know about those guys. So going a little bit more, looking a little bit more into specifically the mammalian kidney. This is a terrestrial adaptation, basically, that we evolved once we started to make that move onto land. So the basic unit of mammalian kidney is a nephron. I would not forget that name, nephron, and that it is associated with the kidney. Filtrate forms when fluid passes from the bloodstream into the Bowman capsule in each nephron. And we have about 1,600 liters of blood that flows through a pair of human kidneys every single day. So your kidneys are extremely, extremely important. And what's amazing is that you can actually live with just one kidney and often just one part of a kidney. Of course, it puts a lot of extra energy on that one kidney when you only have one. 99% of the water and nearly all of the sugars, amino acids, vitamins, and other organic nutrients are reabsorbed into the blood. So when you eat the wrong diet or you're on a specific diet for a long time, like say you're in ketosis or something where you basically have zero carbs, if you're on certain diets for an extended period of time, it's really, really tough on the kidneys. If you have a super duper 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 high protein diet, it's tough on the kidneys also, and you'll actually end up getting kidney failure. But the kidneys are really, really resilient, and oftentimes just simple changes in diet, if you've put yourself in situations like that, can very quickly reverse the effects that have occurred. The proximal tube of the kidney is what reabsorbs ions and water and nutrients, and molecules are transported actively and passively from the filtrate into the interstitial fluid and then the capillaries. Some toxic materials are actively secreted directly into the filtrate. This descending loop of the whole thing over here is called this loop of Henle, and the descending part where filtrate is pushing down, what occurs here is reabsorption of water, and movement is drawn by the high osmolarity of the interstitial fluid. I would understand that the filtrate becomes it's at its most concentrated. It's becoming more and more concentrated as it comes down. And the opposite, it becomes more and more and more dilute as it goes up. Okay, so let's watch this thing about the Bowman's.
Nephrons regulate the composition of blood by a combination of three processes that transfer materials between the nephron tubules and the capillaries that serve them: filtration, secretion, and reabsorption. A nephron tubule and the blood vessels surrounding it have been straightened and simplified in this diagram. The gradation of color, lighter on top, darker on the bottom, corresponds to an increasing concentration of solutes in the interstitial fluid surrounding the nephron toward the center of the kidney. As blood flows through the glomerulus, a knot of porous capillaries, water and virtually all other molecules small enough are forced by blood pressure out of the glomerulus and into Bowman's capsule. This process is called filtration, and the fluid that accumulates in Bowman's capsule is called filtrate. Blood contains blood cells, plasma proteins, water, sodium chloride, hydrogen ions, bicarbonate ions, urea, glucose, amino acids, and possibly some drugs and poisons. Blood cells and plasma proteins stay in the blood. They are just too big, but all the other substances are filtered from the blood and form the filtrate that accumulates in the nephron tubule. As the filtrate moves along the proximal tubule, certain substances are transported from the blood and added to the filtrate, a process called secretion. Secretion of hydrogen ions helps to regulate body pH. Certain poisons are also secreted to remove them from the blood. This list summarizes substances contained in the filtrate. Filtration is not selective, so some of these substances are useful to the body, and it is important that they be returned to the blood. The kidneys generally need to recover water, sodium chloride, bicarbonate ions, and nutrients such as glucose and amino acids. This reclamation of valuable solutes in water is called reabsorption. Let's look at the process of reabsorption as the filtrate continues its journey through the nephron tubule. In the proximal tubule, reabsorption of bicarbonate ions helps regulate the blood's pH. Sodium chloride, glucose, and amino acids are actively transported out of the filtrate. This leaves the filtrate more dilute than the surrounding interstitial fluid, so water follows by osmosis. These solutes and water re-enter the blood. As the filtrate moves down the loop of Henle, the concentration of solutes increases in the interstitial fluid surrounding the nephron tubule. Since this portion of the tubule is permeable to water, water leaves by osmosis and is reabsorbed into the blood. This concentrates the filtrate. In the ascending loop, the surrounding fluid becomes more dilute. This portion of the loop is impermeable to water but not sodium chloride. Sodium chloride diffuses out, lowering the solute concentration of the filtrate and adding to the solute concentration of the surrounding fluid. Near the top of the loop, sodium chloride is actively transported out, further diluting the filtrate. More substances are reabsorbed from the distal tubule. Sodium chloride is actively transported out of the filtrate. Bicarbonate ions may be reabsorbed too, helping to regulate body pH. Some drugs and poisons are secreted from the blood into the filtrate at this point. And this is another place where hydrogen ions may also be secreted into the filtrate to further adjust pH. There is a lot going on here. The main point is that the nephron is able to expel unneeded or harmful substances from the blood by filtration and secretion into the filtrate, and the nephron can reabsorb substances useful to the body.
Okay. Distal tube, collecting duct. I would just kind of review yourself on what these things do. Here's collecting duct.
The filtrate enters the collecting duct. As it moves down the collecting duct, it passes through a region where the surrounding fluid has a higher and higher solute concentration. Water leaves the collecting duct by osmosis, concentrating the remaining filtrate into urine. Urea is one of the main body wastes in urine, but here some urea actually diffuses out of the filtrate. The urea performs a useful function by adding to the solute concentration of the interstitial fluid and causing even more water to be reabsorbed from the filtrate. Even though most of the water has been reabsorbed from the filtrate, urine is still 95% water. The most abundant solute is urea, along with other nitrogenous wastes. There is some sodium chloride and traces of other ions such as calcium and potassium. Hydrogen ions make urine acidic, and drugs and toxins may also be present.
Okay. These things you can just read on your own. Adaptations of vertebrate kidneys to diverse environments. So there are going to be adaptations when with the many environments that animals are going to be living in. There are going to be different adaptations, and I would just kind of very generally familiarize yourself with them. Desert-dwelling mammals excrete the most hyperosmotic urine and have long loops of Henle. And that's because they've got to have a lot of water, right? Birds have shorter loops of Henle but conserve water by excreting uric acid instead of urea. Okay, so antidiuretic hormone ADH makes the collecting duct temporarily more permeable to water so it can absorb more water. And so one thing that alcohol will do and caffeine will do is it will kind of block the ability of ADH to work. And so you're just releasing a lot of water as opposed to absorbing all that water.
Hormones regulate water reabsorption by the nephron tubule in response to body fluid intake and loss. On a hot day, when you're sweaty and thirsty, blood solute concentration rises. In response, the brain signals the posterior pituitary to increase its output of the hormone ADH. ADH makes the walls of the collecting duct more permeable to water. Recall that the interstitial fluid surrounding the nephron tubule has a high solute concentration. ADH allows more water to leave the filtrate by osmosis and re-enter the blood. The body conserves water and concentrated urine is produced. When you have been drinking more water and not losing much fluid, the blood becomes more dilute. The brain responds by decreasing the secretion of ADH. The collecting duct becomes less permeable and less water is reabsorbed. The body produces dilute urine.
Okay, I think I'm wrong on that with the alcohol and caffeine. I think what it does is it stops the brain from producing a lot of ADH. Or it makes you produce more ADH, I guess. And so opposite, sorry. Reduces ADH. And so you don't reabsorb all the water. And so it just kind of basically continues to flow through you. And so, when you've had a whole lot of tea or you drink a whole lot of beer, you're going to pee a lot more than if you drank the same amount of just plain water.